Okay, we're going to get started. My name's Tim. I'm Tim and Sony, I'm the airport manager. I want to thank Tom for coming here. We had a couple, I'm going to step out on this light, a couple suggestions to have this here, the traffic pattern seminar. This is about the 10th time in 2 years Tom has presented this. So I reached out to Tom and he graciously agreed to do this. Tom is doing this no charge on his own time, so donations in the back are greatly welcomed. Also, speaking of the back, we have our traffic pattern pamphlet that the airport has and has it on our website. And then a much cooler item, make sure you don't leave with a couple of your S50 stickers that we just put together. Administratively, there's bathrooms right here. I want to thank our gracious host, Jay Miner. Jay, raise your hand. And after the conclusion of this, Jay is going to have a social hour in his other hangar. Correct, Jay? Here or over there? Over there. Just a couple hangar units west. So with that, let's actually get and there's Dale. Dale, raise your hand. We were just talking about you. Show of hands, how many pilots here are student pilots? So Tom just kind of gets a gauge on his audience. And then CFIs, rotorcraft, and then private pilots. So we got a good mix. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tom. Tom is a 25,000 hour commercial pilot, CFI, MEI, NAFI master instructor, worked for Alaska Airlines for 31 years and currently is employed by Old Time Aviation and flies a whole host of the fleet they have over at Bremerton. Thanks, Tom.
You bet. Thanks for the intro. Well, I'm going to stand off to the side because I typically, as I move around, I always walk in front of the screen, so just yell at me if you can't see what I'm saying or what I've got up there. I put this thing together. It takes a little bit of an introduction before I just jump right into the material. Just before I retired from Alaska Airlines, well, actually about 10 years before I retired, I got back into general aviation and started flying. I had a Beaver for about 4.5 years before the maintenance killed me and I had to get rid of that. But I did a lot of float plane flying and a lot of tailwheel flying with friends and things like that, and got back into aviation. I taught seaplane operations up at BIFA at Renton. And then once just a few years before I retired, I sold the place here in Covington and moved out to Mason Lake. I don't know if anybody knows where Mason Lake is, but out there near Belfair and closer to the Bremerton Airport. And I ran into Ken Horowitz and Kate, and they have a fleet of 23 airplanes out there that they provide a lot of scenic rides in, but they didn't have anybody doing any instruction in them. So I jumped into their airplanes and started doing instruction. I instruct in the Citabria, the Super Decathlon, the J3 Cub, the Super Cub. We have four Stearman. So we have two 450 Stearmans and two 220 Stearmans that I'm flying, and then a T6. And we were hoping that maybe this summer I'd start doing a little instruction in the T6 as well. So anyway, so that's kind of what I do for fun these days. But as I got into the traffic pattern, got into general aviation again, boy, I had to really start scratching my head when I came out to some of these non-towered airports going, what is going on? Because it just wasn't the same as what I remembered 40-some years ago when I gave up general aviation for the first time. I was a CFI. In fact, I got my CFI in 1976. So, but I was concerned about safety and the lack thereof, if you will, in the non-towered airports, and the lack of standardization. So I started doing research, and I called some of my friends. Once upon a time in the Air Force, in a previous lifetime, I was also an aerospace officer and a liaison with the FAA. I designed instrument approaches and attended basically for the Air Force, did airspace work with them, doing instrument approaches and designing procedures and things like that. So I'd been to Oklahoma City, been to the school, knew a few people back there. So I started making some phone calls. and reliving some old friendships. And I was able to get an audience with the 600 office back in Washington, D.C., which I don't know if you know, that would be the office that you don't want to hear from. It's where all the lawyers live back in Washington, D.C. And so I was able to get a phone conference going with two of the lawyers back there, and able to ask them a number of questions about these operations, about non-towered, the publications, and basically the current state of affairs. And they did tell me that after the Watsonville crash down here in California, that they were going to be changing the advisory circular. So I knew about that a little bit ahead of time, and I wrote an article for the Washington Pilots Association. It was published last December, I think. Anyway, without further ado, what I did is I did a lot of research. I talked to a lot of people about this stuff, and I tried to make sure that everything that I put in here is referenced, page, paragraph, everywhere I got it. I'm not pulling it out of thin air anywhere. All right, and that's kind of who I am up there, as we already talked about that. So let's dive into this thing and talk about what we're going to talk about. This is pretty basic stuff. A lot of people think this is, so basic that we shouldn't really be spending a lot of time on it, but apparently we need to. So what I'm going to do is I want to just kind of get into the safety and the reasons why we're here, and then we're going to talk about all those things up there, the regulations, the traffic pattern, entries, exits, radio calls, and the right-of-way, and I'll try to sum it up and give you some simple things to remember, to take away. The airline industry does a great job. Right now, they're at about 0.003 accidents per 100,000 hours flown, and as I flew F-15s in the military, and you can imagine that was far from a safe environment, but we still, in the military, they still have an accident rate that is less than one accident per 100,000 hours flown. Let's take a look at general aviation now. This is a current chart that you can get from the NTSB website through 2021. It's a partial there. It is decreasing. The total number of accidents are decreasing. But if you look down there at those numbers and you pull it out of the chart, we're still at about 6 accidents per 100,000 in general aviation. What does that mean in terms? 100 accidents a month in general aviation. And those are only the accidents that are reportable to the NTSB. There's even more accidents on top of that. I think there's 8 gear-up landings a week in the United States. 8 a week. And there's 5 ground loops a week in the United States that don't make the NTSB data. So we've got some work to do here. And so let's talk a little bit more specifically, though, about the safety record as it pertains to non-towered airports. This is a chart of mid-air collisions here for the last few years. 62% of all mid-air collisions are dual with a CFI on board. They're all happening at non-towered airports. There was only one accident in the last 5 years at a towered airport. All the rest of them are happening at non-towered airports or within 5 miles of the non-towered airports. 96% there. And then right now, even with this better record that we have down here, we're still at 1 a month in the United States. We have 1 mid-air collision a month in the non-towered traffic patterns. So I'm hoping that gives you a little bit of a motivation to really rethink about what you're doing in the non-towered traffic patterns. It's all in the news. There's a bunch of news articles I have here, but up in Alaska even, in 15 years they had 14 mid-air collisions up there. All of them were within 5 miles of the Talkeetna Airport. They were all up there. So it's a pretty serious issue. This is a picture of the accident that caused the change to 96.6 Charlie now. And you can see that the twin was doing a straight in, the Cessna 150 with a brand new private pilot in it. The ink wasn't even dry on his license. And he did not realize when this aircraft here, the twin called 5 miles, that he was still doing 180 miles an hour. And you'll see that this picture was taken less than a mile off the end of the runway, and the twin still doesn't have their gear down. So the supposition is that they were actually just going to do a high-speed flyby the runway, and but they were calling straight in. 68% of all mid-air collisions occur on final, and there's reasons for it. But one of the big ones is extending the downwind wide patterns and the straight-ins, and that's why they changed Advisory Circular 96.6B and essentially do not recommend straight-ins when there's anyone else in the pattern. That's what the change was. And it was because of this accident and that statistic. There are a couple other reasons why not to do why not to extend your patterns. There's the engine failure, which I've been told for 50 years of flying. My old instructor said, "Oh, don't get too far from the airport. If the engine quits, you got to be able to glide to it." And I always was fairly incredulous about that reason until I lost 2 engines. So I did one in Phoenix and one at Chino, California, and I did the 700-foot turnaround there. So, and then dragging the power in on final, it's something that maybe the airlines do, but it's not really what general aviation airplanes are designed for. But that's another subject for another day. This is a picture from my flight. I spend 300 hours a year in the traffic pattern over at Bremerton teaching tailwheel operations, so I get a chance to take lots of pictures. And I typically have my clients fly anywhere from a half to 3/4 of a mile in the pattern. The FAA, we're going to see later on, recommends anywhere from a half mile to a mile. But very often I see other training aircraft well outside of the mile recommended by the FAA. So it's just a picture there. So I got a little video here from a friend of mine, Paul Bertorelli, down in Florida. And let me see if I can get this to go and you guys can hear it.
Hello, everyone. This is Paul Bertorelli reporting for AvWeb. The reason I have my flight instructor shirt on is in this video we're going to take a look at a curious and unexplained phenomenon, and that's why flight instructors teach their students to fly enormous traffic patterns. Take a look at this genuine NASA animation shot from the space shuttle. As you can see, things here at my home airport are getting entirely out of hand.
We interrupt this video with a note from our legal department. This is not a NASA animation. It is a preposterous and poorly rendered fake. Do not take it literally.
Well, anyway, my theory is that we started to fly gigantic patterns when flight instructors started to dress like this, and we knew that when their pimples cleared up, they were going to be jet pilots.
But 150s ain't jets, and the problem with large patterns is that they tend to encourage long, straight-in finals. That means you're dragging the airplane in with power, and you're not honing your ability to adjust your glide path visually. You're training yourself to be a one-trick pony.
So the problem that we have is not in the Pacific Northwest, it's nationally. Everybody's having a problem with long straight-in finals. So here's a couple other problem areas that I've seen over the last couple of years. This particular one here, this aircraft flew directly over the top of me on downwind and then did a little, I don't know what you want to call it, a little princess pirouette at the end of the downwind and then entered the downwind there. And then here's another one. I know a lot of us do these, the direct entry to downwind. I'm going to teach you why that's been causing some mid-air collisions lately. And we'll talk about that. This one here is an interesting one. We're on runway 2, so it's right-hand traffic. Somebody decides they're going to enter left-hand traffic. And then this guy here, he just flew right through the traffic pattern, 500 feet below traffic pattern altitude. He was fixed wing, didn't talk to anybody, didn't say a word, just flew right through the traffic pattern. And I was able to catch this. And then we got another one here. This one here is an interesting one. I originally thought it was a 135 degree, 45 degree entry to the downwind. Talked to the pilot later and they said, well, no, we were just aborting the entry because of the crosswind traffic. The problem is they turned the wrong way. They turned into the traffic instead of with the traffic. We'll talk about that. And then the last one, my favorite, they were going to fly over the top of the field for a teardrop entry, but they descended right through pattern altitude over the downwind right there. Kind of a serious safety issue there. All right, so all of those, by the way, were taken on 1 day and 2 flights in the traffic pattern at Bremerton. Here's one of the things I want to emphasize to the CFIs in the room is the law of primacy. The first things that people learn are the things that are going to be the hardest for them to get rid of if they're wrong, and they're the things that are going to stick with people the longest. So why then do we teach in aviation that there's a big difference between regulations and guidance? The FAA puts out a lot of guidance to us in the form of, quote, non-regulatory publications, and we always make a big deal when we're training our clients about, well, these are regulations and this is guidance. And you know that what the message that's being received there is that, well, once I get my license, I guess I don't have to pay attention to that other stuff. And that whole concept is starting to go away with the FAA, the whole concept of having non-regulatory and regulatory, and I'm going to talk about that. But it is, I think, a contributing factor to the accident rate in the United States because most of these accidents that are happening at non-towered airports are happening because people are making it up in the non-towered traffic pattern. So what are the laws? One of the things I started pulling what hair I had left out about 3 years ago is I sat on a webinar during COVID that was sponsored by the EAA, and a gentleman from Connecticut got on board, and he was a very highly qualified CFI, and the first thing out of his mouth was, well, there aren't any regulations that apply to the non-towered airport. And I went, well, wait a minute. So anyway, here's 4 of them right off the top of my head. 91, 126, and 127 basically describe the non-tower traffic pattern for both Class G and E airspace. This one right here, you might think is not a traffic pattern regulation. Which regulation of these 4 do you think that the FAA violates the most pilots for? It's 111 right there, operating near other aircraft. And then 91, 113 are the right-of-way rules. So let's see what, we're going to digest what those things do. They essentially give us 4 rules. They say that we got to make our left turns unless the airport publishes right, like they do at Bremerton. Helicopters must avoid the fixed wing traffic. Aircraft in the traffic pattern have the right of way over aircraft that are not in the traffic pattern. Don't overtake aircraft in the traffic pattern. Those are all regulations. Lower on final, but let's hope that we don't have 2 people on final at the same time. But lower on final, and then be nice. They actually regulate being nice to other people in the traffic pattern, and they give us a bunch of rules down there that you can read about why we want to be nice in the traffic pattern. But the FARs, as we call them, know and love them, the rules don't stop there. We have a ton of other publications that give us rules. It's a little blurry up there, I apologize, but we have advisory circulars, the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, the Airplane Flying Handbook, we have the the Aeronautical Information Manual. There's a lot of guidance out there in addition to regulations, and this is why I made the statement that the FAA is slowly, at a snail's pace, trying to reverse the whole paradigm that we have regulations and then rules that you don't have to follow. And what they've done is they've commissioned 2 years ago the dynamic regulatory system. And you might say, well, what the heck is that? They included all the regulations and all of their publications into the dynamic regulatory system. And I asked the lawyers, what does that mean? They said, well, with the FARs, we have to go through the rulemaking process. We have now got Congress to buy off on us calling this the regulatory system, and we've put all of these things that were formerly non-regulatory into the dynamic regulatory system, so we don't have to do the rulemaking process to change these, but they are eventually going to be the same force as a regulation. It's a change that's happening. So that's one of the things that I wanted to let people know is slowly, at a very snail's pace, the FAA is moving toward making these things that we have been seeing for the last 50 years that I've been flying. Oh, that's non-regulatory. I don't have to do that. They're starting to make it. There's other stuff down here that would compel a pilot to start following these rules. But between the safety and the fact the FAA is moving that way, let me give you one more reason to follow these things. All of the ACSs that have been published now require that pilots, in order to pass their check rides, they have to follow the recommended procedures. So if there's a recommended procedure in any of those publications, advisory circulars, Airman's Information Manual, the flight handbook, all of that stuff now is incorporated into the ACS. And there's no more reason for CFIs to teach a distinction between regulatory and non-regulatory. They're all just rules. Okay? Yeah?
How about if your POH is different from the airplane flying in?
POH takes priority, and there's a rule for that. There's plenty of justification for that. Okay, there's even more guidance. We have the chart supplement. It used to be called the Airport Field and Facilities Chart Supplement. It's now the digital chart supplement because they update them on a weekly basis now. And you can go online and get the updates. But I also, as a plug in here for Tim in the office, airport managers, when I come out here, I also show them this paragraph right here. In the digital chart supplement, it gives instructions, detailed instructions for airport managements on how they can change their chart supplements more regularly. It's not a difficult system anymore. There's an online form for it. There's these little blue letters are a link. They can go on there and they can change stuff if they want to in that chart supplement to get the information out to pilots. So here's the Auburn one, and it just says pertinent information. You know, take a look at pertinent information. Well, what pertinent information? I don't know. I'm not hitting on Tim here. I'm just saying, you know, maybe it's a reminder of 91-103. I don't know. But to me, as a pilot, that's not very clear. And I want to also emphasize as we go through the rest of my presentation that the rules that I'm going to talk about are not made for Auburn. They're not made for the Pacific Northwest. They're made for every single pilot in the United States, and foreign pilots that come into the United States have to follow these rules. And so the FAA might seem like they move at a snail's pace on a lot of this stuff, but it's primarily because they have to keep everything in line with the ICAO, and they have to, just because something works, you know, in this part of the country, it may not work in that part of the country, and they have to move everybody together. So here's just an example of another airport. This is Arlington, tough to read, but it says up there, for additional details and rules and local procedures, and they put a website in there. More and more airports around the country are starting to put those websites in there, and what's happening is that they publish things like this, these chart depictions. Now, here's the one for Auburn is here, but you have to go onto the city website to find that, and a pilot might be arriving from Kalamazoo, you know, and not have any clue that there's something on the city website. And what the FAA is trying to do is to get city managements and municipalities and county managements to start putting this stuff in the airport supplement so that pilots, no matter where they're from, have a fighting chance to know what those local procedures are. And also for airport management, the FAA is working on a process to standardize all these graphic depictions as well. The guys down in Oklahoma City are going to do that at some point. All right, that's the introduction. Let's talk about traffic patterns now. Everybody's seen this traffic pattern depiction in the publications, I'm sure. Couple important things here to bring to your attention is that traffic patterns and airport operations are allowed to be adjusted for local conditions. And that's where the chart supplement comes in. And that's where airport managements can get involved and change traffic pattern operations for local conditions. It's right in the regulations. But the rest of the point of this chart is that the FAA recommends in their publications that the traffic pattern be flown 1 mile to a half mile from the runway. Not 2 miles, not 1.5 miles. And logic dictates then that you would not have a final longer than 1 mile because you're going to fly an equally spaced pattern. It should be 1 mile out and 1 mile on final. Jet traffic, different animal. Their 1,500 feet traffic pattern, they're 3 miles, and they can't roll out less than 3 miles from the end of the runway. So I'm just talking general aviation. What is not included in the traffic pattern descriptions? Straight-ins, instrument approaches, military-style overhead patterns. And yes, military overhead style patterns, whether you know what they are or not, they are mentioned in 9066 Charlie. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we get into the rules of the road, or the right of way. So everybody's probably seen this chart too, and a lot of people don't, when they look at the charts, they look at the picture and they go, okay, yeah, I got that. But very seldom do they go down here and read in detail all of the notes that go with these charts. So from the notes down here, just a couple of big highlight things. You're supposed to enter the traffic pattern in level flight at the traffic pattern altitude on a 45 degree to midfield. Midfield. Well, and then the other biggie is well clear of anyone else in the traffic pattern. And then just kind of take a quick note here, where this is going to come up later in the presentation, landing direction indicator. In addition to the normal 45 degree entry, the FAA publishes 2 alternate entries. Alternate entry A and alternate entry B. Alternate entry A is very commonly called the teardrop, but it gets screwed up almost every time I see it happen out there, because what happens is people look at the picture and they go, oh, okay, I know how to do that. I'll just do a descending 270 degree turnaround to downwind. And they forget to read this note right here that says fly 2 miles away from the airport before descending. So people have in their mind that teardrop is this descending turn, and it specifically says, no, fly 2 miles away from the airport before you descend, turn around and enter on the 45. And it says yield to downwind traffic. Okay, and that was a quick picture of what it looks like when somebody does that descending. Here I am in this airplane, and this guy was doing a descending 270 degree turn with another guy on downwind there too. So it does happen all the time. All right, alternate entry B. This one I wish the FAA had never, ever even dreamed of. It causes more problems than any other entry to the traffic pattern combined. And again, the devil's in the details. It's in the notes. And it says down here, yield to everybody else if you're going to do this. And then the most important note is this technique should not be used if the pattern is busy. What on earth is pattern busy? Everybody has their own definition. I have briefed this with a lot of the DPEs in the local. Do I have any DPEs in here? Okay. I had a meeting with the DPEs about 6 months ago, and the DPEs have a very simple rule now. If there's anyone else in the traffic pattern, it's busy, and they have flunked people for using this arrival on check rides. So why? Why would people have such a harsh view of what the term busy means? And the reason is because all it takes is one other airplane on downwind, and you come flying over the runway at pattern altitude and turn directly in there, you're going belly up to them. You're violating the see and avoid concept. You're violating FAR 91-113 paragraph B about see and avoid. You can't go belly up to people and see them. So why is this even in there? And the FAA has a very simple answer. There are thousands of airports out in the Midwest that have one operation a day. And this is designed for those airports that aren't busy, that there's nobody there. And I've flown to many of those. But when you get into airports in an area like the Puget Sound or down in the LA Basin, you can't do this entry. You just can't. Because you're going to go belly up to somebody on downwind and cause a conflict. Yeah.
Do you think that the FAA is going to come up with a term that we can use which says, announce your intentions? If I say I'm doing alternate entry B here, nobody will know what on earth that is. I usually say direct, I announce my position over midfield, direct entry to down.
Yeah. We're going to do a whole lot of questions at the end of this thing, but we're going to talk about radio calls and how to do all that down here in a little bit later. So anyway, that's the deal with this direct entry. Okay, so back to the 45-degree entry here, and this is what I was talking about with that one person that was doing the aborted entry. They were turning the wrong way and into traffic. The whole reason that the 45-degree entry was designed is because it keeps you clear of the departing and the crosswind traffic. You enter in the middle of the pattern and you have an exit without conflicting with anyone. But you don't have that if you turn the wrong way. So that's really important. That's why the 45-degree entry was designed the way it is. Okay, so let's look at some really bad examples of the 45. I think maybe I've got a blow up of this here. Let's see. There's that one. We talked about that. All right, so here's the correct 45-degree entry to midfield. This is a poor one, but it'll probably work even on a check ride. This one, you will fail your check ride if you do this. If you're flying for a check ride, the DPEs will fail you for this. Because you are flying in somebody else's airspace, the crosswind people and departures. The ones that come even further out here are going head-to-head with people on the 45-degree departure. They want you in the middle of the field to get you away from the stuff that's happening down at this end of the runway. And here's an example of it right here. There's a guy on crosswind. That's me on downwind, crosswind, and here's somebody trying to do an entry right where the crosswind guy is. And that's how it turns out. Back here, it's a gaggle on downwind. All right, what are some of the entries that we see day in and day out there that are not described by the FAA? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. There are only 5 entries to the non-tower traffic pattern described by the FAA in any publication. And there they are. The 45-degree entry, alternate A, alternate B. You can enter the traffic pattern after a straight in when you do a touch and go and announce your intentions to enter the traffic pattern. You are now entered the traffic pattern. And the military overhead. There's some real, when I advise people, because I do military overheads when I'm out flying the T6 and I'm doing stuff with the Warbird guys, and I advise them, I said, we cannot do these if the pattern is busy. We need to use the same concept as that alternate entry B. If there's other people in the traffic pattern, we ought not be doing this overhead pattern because they don't know. You can't have enough words on the radio to describe what you're doing to a student pilot who is just trying to solo the airplane for the first time. They have no idea what you're doing. So this whole concept of using the military overhead pattern, even though it's something near and dear to me, and I did it for many years professionally, it really doesn't, it has a very limited place in non-towered airports. All right. So all the other entries that you see are brought from towered airports. They're not described, they're not authorized by the FAA. So everything else that you can imagine, and what are some of those other ones, just to beat a dead horse here, what are they? The base entry. The problem with the base entry, as the FAA described to me, is that nobody knows where you are. You can call base, but are you here? Are you here? The idea that we have this traffic pattern is so that when somebody calls a position, you can look out your window and look where they are. If you're on downwind and somebody calls base, you're looking for them here, and they're coming in from the opposite direction, and we have had mid-airs. 16% of the mid-airs over the last 20 years have been base entries. The other one I mentioned before is this direct entry to the downwind. We see it all the time. People are trying to expedite their entry. It just makes sense to them that they don't have to go out here and then come in, even though most of us are all trying to build flying time, so why not do the extra flying, right? But they do this entry, and the problem is the same thing with that poor 45-degree entry. You're flying in somebody else's airspace. That airspace is designed for crosswinds and departures, not for the entry to the downwind. And it conflicts. It is part of that 16% of the mid-air collisions are happening because of these poorly executed entries. The last one down here, I'm going to go through these slides really quick. I have these slides in for another presentation. Again, I listened to an online presentation, and a gentleman from back east went into great detail about an upwind entry. Like everybody knows what an upwind entry is. And I was scratching my head, and I'm going, and I went through the publications, and so then I asked the FAA, I said, what's with it? And they go, there's no such thing. And I said, okay, that's what I believe. So where on earth is an upwind entry coming from? And it's on the internet. You can find descriptions in publications about an upwind entry to a non-towered airport. And the FAA has never, ever, not in the 50 years I've been flying, ever published anything about an upwind entry. So where the heck does it come from? Well, it's probably this diagram right here in the FAA publications, and it says upwind leg. Okay? But notice that that's in paragraph 432, airports with operating control tower. It's not in the non-towered airport operations. So in the AIM and the Airplane Flying Handbook, it's Section 3, airports with operating control tower. That's what an upwind leg is. So the upwind leg is a course flown parallel to the landing runway in the same direction, The upwind leg is flown at controlled airports after a go-around. There is no such thing as an upwind entry to a non-towered traffic pattern. So I want to beat that dead if I can, because I see it at least twice a year over at Bremerton. All right, let's jump away from entries to exits. There's only two. Two exits from the non-towered traffic pattern. Straight out, or when you get to pattern altitude, you turn 45 degrees toward the pattern. How can you screw that up? There's only two to remember, right? That's it. But we see all kinds of other departures. And the problem is, this is the airspace that's been set aside for you and your departure. And when you go anywhere else, you're getting into somebody else's airspace. There was a young man who was taking a check ride right here in Auburn. I won't tell you who the DPE was, but the DPE failed him because he climbed out on departure here, and below traffic pattern altitude, he made a right turn and headed up the other way. It's not the procedure. So he didn't pass his check ride. The downwind departure is probably the most often seen wrong departure out of a non-towered airport there is. Why do we do it? Because, well, I want to go the other way. So I don't want to go that way. I just want to go that way, right? Yeah, I may be trying to build flying time, but I don't want to go that way. Here's the deal. All you got to do is fly this departure 45 degrees out, and when you're 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude, you can go in any direction you want to go. But they want you to make that climb out here, not here, because you have people coming in on the 45 and you have other people in the traffic pattern. And yes, another problem here at Auburn. A friend of mine that's a CFI here had a student on their very first solo. He's in the traffic pattern, flying a traffic pattern to 1-6. Took off, crosswind. There was another Cessna 172 in front of him. And that, whether that guy made a radio call or not, who knows. But he continued out to the north, heading toward Renton. And the solo student didn't want to turn base because he was following the guy. And that solo student ended up in the Class D airspace in Boeing Field in Renton doing orbits lost. You can't do these downwind departures because it's not your airspace. This is your airspace here for departure. You go down here, climb 500 feet above pattern altitude, and go in any direction you want. If you wanted to go up here 500 feet above pattern altitude and fly right back over the top of the field, perfectly legit. But they just don't want you, they want you to stay out of the traffic pattern when you're doing it. Okay, this is a really hard slide to read. Don't even try, okay, because I've got some expanded ones here. But the question up here is there an active runway at a non-towered airport? Okay, I've been hearing this question for 50 years. How many people say there's an active runway at a non-towered airport? Okay, how many people say there's not an active runway? Okay, well, it's sort of a trick question because truly there is not a, quote, active runway at a non-towered airport, but this is another thing I want you to keep your eyes open for because slowly but surely, at a snail's pace, the FAA is changing this policy. And the changes that occurred actually in 9066B and, have been brought forward in Charlie, in 2017, they changed all of this stuff. And let's see here. The biggest thing that they changed in 2017 is we no longer have any wind indicators at the airport. We have landing direction indicators. Okay? So why is that important? If you read through all of this stuff here, I'm going to kind of expand it here a little bit. Okay, landing and takeoff should be accomplished on the operating runway most nearly aligned with the wind. So they're saying these are landing direction indicators. Pilots using the secondary runway, if you have one, they have to avoid the flow of traffic to the runway that is most closely aligned to the wind. Pilots are expected to observe aircraft in the pattern and conform to the pattern, and that is going to cause problems because if the pattern is wrong, what do? They've even got that covered here. 10.7, paragraph 10.7 of 9066 Charlie, disagreements. And it tells you that it's hard to read it here, but it says an aircraft might be using the runway different from the one favoring the most prevailing winds. In this case, one option is to simply point out the current winds to the other aircraft and indicate which runway you're going to use because of the current meteorological conditions. So what they're doing is they're slowly, at a snail's pace, changing this guidance, and they're moving toward active runway at a non-towered airport. The most difficult airport in this particular local area is Arlington. Arlington has a north-south runway, and then they have a northwest-southwest runway. many times when I go up there with a tailwheel airplane, the winds are coming out of the northwest, not out of the north. So most closely aligned to the runway is runway 29. There are people who absolutely, positively refuse to use 29 for whatever reason. And they stay on 3-4, even though the winds may be even up to 10, 15 miles an hour out of the northwest. By God, I'm staying on 3-4 because that's what I learned on, and I'm not going anywhere else. So then they end up having a situation where you have two patterns going at the same time. One day I was up there, I had two of us in the 2-9 pattern. There were two people in the 3-4 pattern. So now our patterns are intersecting here, right? Because I'm downwind, they're downwind. Then they intersect again as we get ready to turn final. And then once again at the approach end of the runway. And then I had a Cirrus come in from the south and do a direct entry to this runway, which was runway 16. They did a direct entry with two guys on downwind going south. He goes north on downwind at traffic pattern altitude and proceeds to do a touch and go on 16 and then departs the pattern to the south. It's a flying circus up there. And if you go back to that stuff that was written in there, I don't know if I have it. No, if you go back and read 9066 Charlie now, in that paragraph, they talk about only one pattern may be active at a time. So the pattern for the runway that is most closely aligned to the winds is the pattern. And if you have to, for whatever reason, operational, maybe there's a perfectly valid safety reason why you need to use the other runway, you have to stay well clear of the other traffic pattern. All right, last thoughts on the pattern here is really need to work on our turning base 45 degrees from the end of the runway. But if you do have to extend because of straight in traffic or a practice instrument approach or for whatever reason, you really need to start telling people that you're extending your downwind because that's where these 68% of the accidents are occurring. People who extend and make a long final and somebody else come bebopping into the pattern and flies the normal 45 and the two of them meet on final. So if you're going to extend your pattern beyond the 45, you need to tell people. That will really increase your safety. All right, I want to move now to radio calls. Kind of back to where the gentleman here asked me some questions about. There are two rules for you student pilots. There are two unbreakable rules in aviation. One, who you are, where you are, what you want to do. And then the other one is to realize that people are only going to hear half of what you say. And the longer you talk on the radio, the less they hear. Okay? So you just need to understand that it's an inescapable rule of aviation. So in the publications, the rules that have been published, I weeded out all of the radio calls that the FAA is recommending. So 10 miles out, you're supposed to call. And I realize that 10 miles out's a long way for some airplanes. But they're saying approximately 10 miles out, you're supposed to at least announce your intention to land at the airport and give a direction and a distance from the airport so that people can be looking for you. Then you need to call entry to the traffic pattern 2 to 3 miles out. That's in all of those publications right there. And then you have to call each position within the traffic pattern. So that's downwind, base, final, crosswind, and taking the runway for departure. And those are the sources for all of that. There is no requirement for departure leg. At a non-towered airport, it's a departure leg, not an upwind leg. There's no reason to call for go-around when you're at a non-towered airport. There is a rule that you have to call it at a towered airport, but please don't confuse that with the non-towered airports. There's no requirement to do that unless there's a conflict. If you're going around because there's a conflict, then you're supposed to say something. Extended taxi operations, there is no reason to call. And I get this over at Bremerton all the time. I'm taxiing from the upper hangars to the fuel docks. I'm going from the fuel dock to the ramp. There's no reason for any of those radio calls. They're not required. There is a requirement for one call leaving your parking spot if you're going to the end of the runway. And the DPEs will really enforce that. So you are supposed to make one radio call on the ground when you're taxiing for departure at a non-towered airport. But all of these other radio calls, why am I so hard on those? The reason is the radio is there for the people in the air to be calling out these positions down here. These positions are gold. That's what people need to be reporting in the traffic pattern. And when you garbage up the radio with "I'm going to the fuel pits," nobody cares. All right, so some do's. Keep it short. Use only one position in your radio call. Here, let me see if I can get this one to work.
Bremerton traffic says 9700 Foxtrot, entering the pattern on a 45 to downwind. Have traffic in sight, will follow you in. Bremerton. Bremerton traffic, Decathlon 5 Whiskey Mike, 3 mile 45, Bremerton.
Okay, so which one of those radio calls was better? Okay. You will not believe how many times when you put two positions, right? Remember the positions, entry, downwind, base, okay? When you put two of those positions in your radio call, let's go back to rule number 2. How much of it does people hear? Only half. So nobody knows where the heck you are. If you say I'm 45 to downwind, well, are you downwind or are you 45? Because they only hear about half of that. So just use one position in your position calls. That's it. If you forget what you're going to say, get off the radio. Just stop. Take your finger off. Hope people forget and move on, okay? You are allowed to use a shortened call sign according to 9066 Charlie, okay? So you can use your type of airplane, the shortened call sign, but you're not supposed to, and this is a killer for me because for 50 years I've been using, hey, I'm Blue Satabria entering the pattern. That's what I've been saying for 50 years. And I read this thing and I went, oh, crap. Because it specifically says don't use your color in the call. Hey, and if you're a jet, I don't know if we have any active jet guys in here. You might want to tell people you're a jet because I got to tell you, it took me 2 years to figure out that a FEMOM was a jet. You know, and when they're out there in the jet pattern, they're not in the pattern, and you're looking all over for them. You can't find them. So anyway, I just tell those guys, tell people you're a jet. All right, don't have conversations on CTAF. Clock position. Every single time I'm in the traffic pattern, people are trying to get eyes on, you know, and they're trying to talk to the other pilots about where they are, and they're saying, well, you're in my 2 o'clock position. Well, that doesn't do me any good. I don't know where you are. How am I going to know where your clock position is? No, it's the other way around. So I've got a slide for that here. So like here, you know, Cessna on downwind, North American 72 Charlie, I'm your right 4 o'clock. We'll follow you. So you have to tell people where you are in their clock position. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, because it gets screwed up all the time. If we all just did the standard entries, the standard radio calls, we wouldn't have to get on the radio and spend 15 minutes describing how we're going to enter the traffic pattern. And every single day I'm out there, somebody gets on the radio and they tell me, hey, I'm 5 miles north, I'm going to overfly the field, I'm going to go out 2 miles, I'm going to descend, and I'm going to turn and do a 45 to downwind. I don't need to know all that stuff. If we're using standard, that's the whole reason that the FAA publishes standard entries, is so that you don't have to describe to everybody what you're doing. It's just assumed that's what you're doing. Okay, don't announce taxi intentions. We talked about that. Okay, now we're going to get into the right-of-way rules. And I like her attitude, you know. My rule is get out of my way. And that's what I see a lot in the traffic pattern. All right, this is really hard to read again. It's 91-113. There's B, there's G for landing aircraft, but I think I've got a better slide here. Okay, paragraph G. This is an often quoted regulation, and it is most often misinterpreted. Talking directly to the FAA, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we got this straightened out. So, an aircraft while on final approach, okay, that's cool. But you realize that the FAA nor the NTSB has ever defined what final is. There is no definition. So, I'll leave you with that for a second. Or while landing. 1958, the FAA published an official interpretation that specifically said, or while landing means airplanes in the traffic pattern. How many people have ever told you that in your lifetime? Not many, because there's not many people that understand it. But that's where the FAA gets off putting all those yields and stuff in their publication, saying yield to this traffic and yield to that traffic. That's where they get it. Have right-of-way over other aircraft in flight or operating on the surface. The aircraft at a lower altitude has the right-of-way, but it can't take advantage of that. And then down here, or to overtake that aircraft. And that's where the FAA gets that you can't overtake airplanes in the traffic pattern. All right, so that's the FAR side of right-of-way. Let's take a look at some of the other right-of-way rules that are out there. Pilots are encouraged to use the standard traffic pattern. I threw that in as innocuous there, but okay. This is from the old 9066 Bravo. They put in a bunch of words in there that says, straight-in traffic should not disrupt the flow of arriving and departing. They have, I didn't take that out of the presentation because I wanted to make the point that they have taken all of those paragraphs out of there about how the straight-ins did not have the right-of-way. They have taken those all out of there, and they just said down here, to further mitigate the risk of mid-air collisions, remember the 68%, you are not supposed to do a straight-in approach when there's anyone else in the traffic pattern. Okay, and again, they use that damn word busy. So what does busy mean? And then down here, it's really hard to read this, I apologize, but paragraph 9-2 of the new advisory circular, fly the standard traffic pattern, period. Okay, and those are the new things. Okay, when you have somebody doing a straight-in, though, I think it's important to leave this slide in here because we're still going to have people doing straight-ins, practicing instrument approaches and stuff like that. And often I get from my clients, well, when can I turn? Can I go out 10 miles or what do I do? And here's some guidance from me, senior flight instructor, a guy that's been flying for a while. If it's a similar type airplane, 70 to 90 miles an hour or so, when they're outside of 3 miles, you can turn base, as long as you're doing the base at that mile to half a mile point. If you're going to extend your pattern out, then that goes out the window. So 3 miles, if they're outside 3 miles, you're golden. If it's a faster jet or a twin, then 5 miles should be the cutoff. If they're outside, not at 5 miles, but outside 5 miles. Okay, and then this brings up the old FAA FECI rule, and I talked a lot about that at the Puyallup Fair. It is becoming less and less of an issue now that the FAA has changed some of their guidance in the current stuff. But basically what it was is that there was a guy named Fecky. He was an instructor. He was actually a CFII, and he operated out of an airport in New Jersey in the early 1990s. And he knew what I knew and what I just told you. He knew that airplanes in the traffic pattern had right-of-way over airplanes that weren't in the traffic pattern. He also knew that straight-in traffic was not in the traffic pattern. So he just got tired of having to deal with all the straight-in traffic, and so he started flying his traffic patterns regardless of the people on final. And he was turning base in front of people that were clearly lower on final and right in front of him. And he was cutting people off. He made a Cessna Citation go around and re-enter IMC conditions. And I mean, there was a really bad stuff going on. And so the FAA had been hearing about this circus, and so they came out to the airport to observe this on one day when Fecky had his, and he was doing this with students. Talk about the law of primacy. What did those students learn? So anyway, they discovered that he was doing this, and so they, when he landed, they revoked his licenses. And of course, he then appealed, and when you appeal a revocation, you go to the NTSB law judge. That's who adjudicates these cases. So in about, I think it was 1993, they had the court hearing, and the NTSB law judge upheld the FAA. And they said that Fecky was, first of all, he was trying to turn final when there were other people that were lower on final. But most importantly, he violated 91-111. He was flying so close to other aircraft as to cause a collision hazard. For 10 years in general aviation, I heard nothing else but, well, now straight-ins have the right of way. And it was almost like a miracle back in the late 1990s. No one was using the traffic pattern. Everybody was doing straight-ins because, hey, I'm 10 miles, so I'm on final. You know, and because there was no definition of what final was. Slowly, over time, that's gone away, and now the FAA is even publishing, as we saw, 9066 Charlie, where they're saying thou shalt not fly straight-ins anymore. But that's where a lot of this, I'm going to fly a straight-in regardless, that's where it came from. It was back in the early 1990s with Mr. Fecky. Okay, some more right-of-way stuff out of these publications up here. The traffic pattern at a point well clear of any other aircraft. That's a right-of-way thing. So you can't enter the traffic pattern and cut somebody off. You need to enter well clear. And then regarding the alternate pattern entries, make course and speed adjustments that will lead to a successful pattern entry and give way to other aircraft on the preferred 45 or in the traffic pattern. So that's where that right-of-way comes in. People in the traffic pattern have right-of-way, even people trying to enter. Okay, so let's boil it all down real quick. Aircraft lowest on final, except the aircraft that just landed, yada yada, you've read that before. Aircraft established in the traffic pattern. Number 3, aircraft may not pass another aircraft. That means that that aircraft in front of you has the right-of-way. You can't pass somebody on downwind, as I have seen on many occasions. Then the aircraft on a 45-degree entry, you know, the 45-degree has to give way to people in the pattern, but then the next one would be 45. Then aircraft on the alternate entries, then aircraft that are not in the traffic pattern, like instrument approaches and straight-ins and things like that. And it has absolutely nothing to do with right-of-way, but I felt kind of obligated to stick this in here. Helicopters have to stay away from the fixed wing flow. But it's not a right-of-way thing, it's just that they have to avoid it. Okay, that says, Mr. Osborne may be excused, my brain is full. And so I'm thinking just about everybody is, their brains are full. So this is where I just want to sum this thing up, and then we're going to go to questions. Standardize, standardize, standardize. The Air Force does standardization. The airlines do standardization. We need to standardize in order to improve the accident rate in general aviation. Use the standard pattern, standard entries, standard departures. You just have to understand the right-of-way rules, but you know, you don't want to force right-of-way rules because you don't want to be dead right. So, you know, I kind of think of right-of-way as, well, okay, that's great. I'm just going to make sure that I give way. Radio calls need to be short, concise, and that's it. And then keep your traffic pattern within a mile and use the 45-degree to turn base. Okay? So that's some of the other fun things I get to do. There's some spin training, and at that point I want to talk questions. We could probably bring the lights up if you'd like. Yeah. Oh, I know. It's dark out here now.
All right, so I'm Craig Simon. I'm one of the CFI helicopter pilots over at Classic. So we talk about this helicopters avoiding the flow of fixed-wing traffic, and I'm not quite sure that I agree with what your assessment is, and let me explain and quantify that. So typically helicopters do not use a traffic pattern. We're in and out, right?
Right.
So, and that makes sense. You can't be buzzing through the pattern.
Right.
However, the FAR regulation states aircraft established in the pattern. We have to vote, right? So,
And a helicopter is an aircraft.
It's an aircraft. So when we're using the pattern, so when we're working with students, we have to use the pattern. We have to teach them how to color in the lines before
Right,
they
and
learn to color
here
out.
at Auburn, you have a different pattern published, don't you? That deconflicts with the fixed wing flow.
Generally, but when we get into that base and final turn, a lot of times there's some conflict there.
Yeah, and I've talked, and the FAA is the guy, when I was first coming up with this, they wanted me to foot stomp on the fact that it's not a right-of-way thing, it's just that that's the rule, is helicopters need to avoid fixed wing flow. At Bremerton, we have a lot of helicopter traffic over there as well, and they generally fly their approaches on the opposite side of the runway from the fixed wing, and they do their final approaches to the taxiways instead of to the actual runway. And to me, that seems pretty logical. They're avoiding the fixed wing flow. Every single airport is going to have their own local thing going on, but once you're on final, you're on final. And I'm not suggesting that you don't have the right of way. It's just that you're supposed to avoid the fixed wing flow.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Jake?
I talked to two visitors yesterday and the day before on 91 126 B2.
Yeah.
Just what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
The first guy reads the reg just as I do. Second guy read it, thought it was so, but sent it to legal. Got a call back from legal. I've only been down to the airport since 2 o'clock today. I was late getting down. Usually I'm down here in the morning.
Yeah.
I saw 3 go-arounds today. One of them sitting back here now, doing a helicopter, touchdown on the numbers. The downwind traffic went all the way past 18, turned, came back. The helicopter was still on the runway when he got to the airport, had to make a go-around to the left. The next airplane in the downwind also had to go around because the same helicopter was sitting on the center line of the runway.
There's a note
It says the helicopters and paragliders shall not, must not.
There's a note in the chart supplement that says you will not delay on the runway while other aircraft are in the pattern.
And that's what's happening daily here. You
And-
know,
and
I
that's-
see
that's in the chart
six
supplement.
go-arounds a day here. And if we could get them on the taxiway or get them on the grass on the other side, do the pattern where you guys are doing it over the racetrack at 500 feet, but don't get on the runway and sit on the runway.
And
I don't
know. We're just talking to helicopter guys,
I know he's a helicopter
but here's the
guy.
thing. Yeah, just to kind of diffuse that whole thing too. People need to remember that the information provided in the chart supplement is a rule. And it's a rule that the FAA can violate you on because it is published by the FAA.
Right.
And so all I'm saying is there is a remark in the Auburn Field and Facilities saying thou shalt not delay on the runway when other people are in the traffic pattern.
Right. And I didn't call the local FSDO office because I thought we could work this out amongst ourselves. We used to have it worked out here before all the helicopters moved down here to Auburn. When the guys were coming down from Boeing and stuff, we had it worked out. The other thing is that when they hover taxi down north end by my hangar, I had them blowing stuff off the wall the other day with that red helicopter that was hovering down there.
It's kind of off the subject of the non-towered airport, but there is a presentation that is online at FAAsafety.gov now on helicopter wake turbulence that will rock your world.
I know. I've seen it. And it's 3 times the rotor width, not 1 time that they tried to say.
It's 3 times the rotor width for hovering.
Yeah.
But it's 3 miles if they're, what do you call that, transitional flight? Is that where you're going straight forward? When you're just in, they had, about 2 or 3 years ago, the FAA did they started a study on helicopter wake turbulence. And they ended up discontinuing the study because one of the airplanes lost control and almost crashed. And it was in a Citabria, an aerobatic capable airplane. The airplane ended up upside down at 5,000 feet, and the guy couldn't get it righted until about 2,000 feet above the ground. And he was fully 3 miles behind the helicopter, and they were using a Bell Jet Ranger as the helicopter. So there's a new, and it has nothing to do with my non-towered airport thing. It's just something that people need to be aware of. There's a guy down in Kentucky who's giving this presentation, and he's like, I got 25,000 hours in fixed wing. He's got like 30,000 hours in helicopters. And he's making this presentation to people, and you really should go on there and look at it. And I asked him, I said, well, how many helicopter guys know about it? And he goes, no, none of them.
Well, we can work this out here. We don't need to get other people involved, but the delaying on the runway is just.
And that's something I think you need to talk with airport management instead of looking at,
and I know Tim wants the helicopters here. They're generating a lot of revenue for the airport, tie down and fuel and all that. But we're going to have an accident here.
I have a question on the mic.
On the mic. All right. Hey, thanks, Jake.
So switching gears a little bit, question about, so you mentioned something earlier about POH taking precedence, right?
The FAA acknowledges, and every time I have to do a presentation, they say, and make sure that if there's a POH that tells you to do a different procedure, then that's what you're supposed to do.
I was thinking, so this is more of a philosophical question, I guess.
Oh, God, philosophical, I'm good for,
So you mentioned, the downwind departure is incorrect, right?
Correct.
And here, so many people do it largely because of the airspace, right?
Correct. Yes,
Which makes
I understand
sense.
the airspace issue.
So if you have an airport that has a local standard practice that is published as part of, say, the supplement, would that take precedence as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So
it's philosophical. It's not a real thing.
That's what Arlington did. They went down, they got their graphic depiction, put it online, went to Oklahoma City, they put that paragraph in their chart supplement, and now that's golden. That chart supplement is now legal tender, if you want to call it that way. Pilots are required to view that as, what is that, 91-103, making everything that you do known to yourself or whatever.
Okay.
I forget how they word that. But everything that you are going to do that day has to be known before you take off.
That makes sense. I mean, on the less philosophical side, then I guess more of like from your opinion. So so I have students that train out of here, and the question becomes then, do you want to teach them to do that standard departure, but they're going to depart to go down to Thun to do some laps or something? We run into that conundrum of like, I don't want to teach people.
Don't have them do a downwind departure on their check ride. And so what I do is I make sure that they fly the way they're taught, and then I teach the way they should fly. And if downwind departures, you don't do it. And I know they want to go to Fun Field, but the proper way to do that out of Auburn, and the one that won't make them lose their check ride, is if they just go straight out until they're above traffic pattern altitude and then turn around and go.
Okay.
And there's a flyway, on that one chart. I don't know if you can really see it. It's hard to see, but there's a flyway right here, okay? So if you climb to the north and you get above traffic pattern altitude, you can turn and go to the right if you want. I know there's a noise abatement thing there, but if you're above traffic pattern altitude, you're not violating that. So the idea is to teach them how to do it correctly so that they won't then start doing it incorrectly down the road. And it's not just to pass the check ride. I try to make sure that my clients know that this is not just to pass for an endorsement or whatever. This is the way that you should operate forever.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
On that same question, 3-4 departure westbound.
Okay.
You got that Class B, same thing. Now, there's a lot of traffic goes that way, and there's traffic coming in. Right away you stay north of them coming in.
Well,
and they're coming in, and that's
and
that 1B. Now the other part is 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, and 2,000 feet. Clouds, 500 clearance, and all that.
Yeah, you've got a problem at Auburn, and I'm not going to deny it because I've Actually, my first flight at Auburn was in 1989, and I got checked out in an airplane at one of the places here that's no longer around, and took my son up for his first flight. So I've been flying in and out of Auburn for many, many years well, and I totally understand the problems that you have. Doing a westbound departure here, you can't climb all the way above traffic pattern altitude or even do the 45 because, one, you're going to be in the surface area. You can't do that. All right. So I've talked to the DPEs. I said, what do you do? You know, well, what they expect you to do is to climb straight ahead and get above traffic pattern altitude. Then you can go any direction you want. Now, the problem there is that if you're at traffic pattern altitude, you're going to 1,800 feet is getting really close here, right? So what I have been doing in the past is I climb straight ahead and get up out of traffic pattern, and then I do a 270 around, and then get over here and get under the 18 and head out. That's how I do it.
1,000-foot ceiling, 1,500-foot ceiling.
Well, you can't. Are you allowed to fly with a 1,000-foot ceiling?
Clear of traffic depends on where you are.
No, you're not. This is all Class E airspace here. So what are the weather requirements in Class E? This is all Class E airspace down to 700 feet. So in Class E, that's right, 315. So you have to have 500 feet below the clouds. You're in a populated area because it's all yellow, right? So you have to have 1,000-foot clearance. You can't do it with 1,000 feet. You have to have 1,500 feet in order to be able to fly around here VFR. And that's based on the ground elevation being 500 feet, so
you're going to have to go right 270 to come across 1,500 feet to go.
That's the way I do it. I'm just telling you that complies with everything that I've taught tonight, and that's how I do it.
How far south is the hospital on 3-4?
The hospital is on here. It's down here by 18, isn't it?
Yeah,
okay.
About 3/4 of a
the
mile.
hospital is not an issue if you're at traffic pattern altitude. They just don't want you flying over the hospital below traffic pattern altitude is what the chart supplement says. Okay, so.
But you're saying half mile to a mile. That still puts you over the hospital with that, doesn't it?
Oh, for your traffic pattern? No, I don't think so. I think how far down is the hospital?
That's what I'm wondering.
It's about a mile south. This thing says 1 mile south of the
Okay, so it's a mile south. So if you're going past the hospital, you're not really complying with the intent of the mile. Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
I was going to point out a couple things. One is making a call 10 miles out on sounds good, but with my airplane, that's 8 minutes away from the airport, and I don't think people have an attention span that long.
Well, and here's the deal. When they put that in there, they published it approximately. They said approximately 10 miles. So I gave people a number to think of. Approximately could be 15 miles. Approximately could be 5 miles.
They should probably change that to a time sort of thing rather than a distance. But
well, I suppose because with a jet, it's even less time.
But the other thing associated is if you take a look at 91-113, the right-of-way rules, you can trace that right back to the CAA about in 1930s, and airplanes didn't have radios there. So making a radio call is not like calling shotgun in the car, guys. Just because you say you're on final doesn't necessarily mean you're on final. And the last point is I flew from this airport for 8 years without a radio. Lots of fun. What I really recommend is for instructors, strap on a handheld with your own headset, have your student unplug their radio, and see if they can successfully make it into the pattern. You can make the calls with your handheld, but I used to tell people I'm the Nordo your instructor used to warn me about. And it's not just airplanes without radios, because years ago there was a helicopter training outfit that would come here and they would shut down the radios when they got here. And
well, let me just kind of address what you're talking about, because again, with my discussions with the people in Washington, D.C., I've got a little bit of advanced warning on one of the things there. Because of the accident down in Lakeland, Florida, There's going to be a proposed rulemaking to get rid of, people are going to have electrical systems and radios.
Or at least radios.
Well, yeah, they're going to have a radio. And I think the way that it was told to me is that they're going to do something like within 5 miles of a non-towered airport, you have to have a radio and use it. And that's coming out of that Lakeland accident.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So we had actually started some of the discussion for this with you, me, and Dan about the proper way to do a teardrop, and he was pointing out that 2 miles per the kind of notes there is all the way pretty much out to like I-5, right? So if you're going to do a teardrop here, I mean, is that kind of what you're recommending, is going out there, or is there a different way that you would recommend kind of to make sure you get that 45 every time?
The intent is to get you away from the traffic pattern. Remember, they specified traffic patterns a half mile to a mile. So the intent is for you to get out away from the traffic pattern before you descend and come down.
Yeah.
You have a special problem here because of the Class B airspace out here.
Yeah.
There's no denying that there's an issue there. And you've got to be down below 1,800 feet, and going that far out, you end up with everybody converging on the water tanks. I totally get that. What I think needs to happen, and it's not just here at Auburn. We have problems at Bremerton. There's problems down at Funfield. And what I have been encouraging airport managers to do is to hold meetings and discussions. What do you think would help to fix some of the problems that we have? And then the tool is that chart supplement. You can put the information in the chart supplement, and it becomes, and here's the thing. It's not that you're putting it into the chart supplement to make it mandatory rule or anything like that. That's not the point. The point is that you're going to have pilots coming in here from all over the country, and they need a fighting chance to know what the local rules are.
Yeah.
And that's why you have a chart supplement, so everybody is working from the same sheet of music.
Right. So like the diagrams that are on the website, but actually make it as
so
part
the
of this.
diagrams are on the website. All of that stuff is great, but what needs to happen is it needs to be mentioned in the chart supplement.
Yeah. Okay.
Where to find that information, because, you know, guy coming up from Southern California wants to land in Auburn, he's not going to know that there's a city website that has the charts and stuff on there.
Gotcha.
He needs to have a fighting chance to know what local rules you guys come up with.
Yeah.
And the FAA fully acknowledges that airports are allowed to modify their general standard guidance for local conditions, and that's why they put that in the book.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that a doctor with a bonanza or with the money?
Which one?
Coming in from Southern California.
Oh, I don't know. In the case of my brother-in-law, is his Baron. He's a dentist. So. Yeah.
Hey Tom, I'm Steve Cameron. I fly Highlander out of Auburn, and I got my tail wheel cert with you.
Thanks for putting me in the EAA magazine.
I got you in there. You're famous now. So the question I had was, I mean, it's great that we have those 2 new alternate entries. What's the recommended thing? I mean, I hear teardrop for 1. What's alternate entry Bravo? What's the recommended?
Alternate entry Bravo is where you fly over the runway at pattern altitude and then just directly enter downwind.
I got it. Is that the terminology that the FAA wants you to use on the radio?
You know, I don't have a really good answer for that, because in all the FAA documents, even including the right-of-way where they start talking about, they just talk about alternate entries.
Yeah.
The only thing the FAA calls it is alternate entry B. I can't get them to find any other terminology. Most of the people that I hear doing that entry are saying they're doing a direct entry, but that causes confusion because people are thinking they're doing that direct downwind entry that I said is so dangerous. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a good answer for you. If you started saying, "Hey, I'm doing alternate entry B," and somebody says, well, "What's that?" Say, "Hey, call Tom Rogers, and he'll tell you all about it." You know.
So of course, if you're only doing it when nobody else is in the pattern, then
that's the point.
Well, that's the point. Yeah.
And see, that was the other thing I brought up. That's a great point, because I brought that up with the FAA people that I was talking to. I said, this thing needs to be gone. It's dangerous. And they say, well, no, there's thousands of airports out there that have no operations or anything like that. And, they need it. They would like to do it. And this thing with busy and stuff. But one of the other issues with it is that there's no abort. With the 45-degree entry I showed you, there's an abort. They designed it purposely so that you could abort the entry, give way to people in traffic pattern, come back around and do it again. With alternate entry A, you overfly and you're coming in on a 45, you can have an abort. There's no way, once you commit to flying at traffic pattern altitude across the runway, there's no abort. Where are you going to go? I guess you can climb up, but that's about it. And the guys at the FAA said, that's kind of a good point. We never really looked at it that way.
Yeah, but if it's like the straight in, you don't do it when there are people in the pattern, then that works out.
Well,
okay.
this was I've kind of eliminated a whole stick on the straight ins, but one of the things that bugs the crap out of me is when pilot, and I understand what they're doing, it's kind of a touchy-feely thing, but they come in and they go, hey, I'm going to do a straight in if traffic will permit. And I kind of want to get on the radio and ask them, well, when are you going to decide when the traffic permits or not? And if the traffic doesn't permit, what are you going to do? Are you going to go left? You're going to go right? You're going to go up? You're going to go, what are you going to do? Yeah. So this whole idea of, well, I'm going to do a straight in if traffic permits, they don't have that thought out. Ask them what they're going to do. And anyway, so the FAA is kind of taking care of that because they're saying don't do it anymore.
And I'll just say one other thing. It's actually, when I started flying here again, I was actually concerned about flying with all the extra helicopters that weren't here 10 years ago when I was flying here. And I got to tell you that, I wasn't here the day when that other situation was discussed, but I'm amazed at how well the helicopter guys, especially at Classic, actually work really well with everybody in the pattern. I hear radio deconfliction. I see them doing stuff. And then one day, I would say this, the one thing is, a lot of it is because we don't understand them. Who would understand anybody who wants to fly something that if the moving parts stop moving, you don't, okay, you can't land.
There's a lot of teasing about that. But we over at Bremerton, we have a lot of helicopter operations and it all works just great.
Well, so one day I lost track of Craig was doing air taxiing up and down, and he didn't announce it when I was coming in the pattern. But my goldfish attention span, I'd forgotten about it, and I pulled off on a taxiway. I looked left and right, high wing airplane, I didn't see he was right there. So I turned around the corner, so afterwards I went and talked to Craig. We talked about it and talked about how what they do to look out for that kind of thing, how they fly high to avoid rotor wash and things like that. So I think the very best thing is talk to the helicopter guy who's causing the issues if there's an issue.
Yeah,
so,
it's not everybody.
But anyhow.
Yeah.
I've had good luck with Classic too. I haven't had any problems. And we don't have any red helicopters.
Hey, so go ahead.
A few months ago, there was an article in the AOPA magazine, and they mentioned a call something like, I'm 3 miles east, going to do a midfield cross at 1,000 feet to a left downwind, and then it's perfectly clear.
Yeah, and that is, and that's pretty much what you're doing too, is but again, I wish it was a world where we didn't have to make those calls, where we have to describe how we're going to enter, that it was more of a standard thing, but I think in that particular case, that's probably the best way to describe it. Yeah.
On the same topic, coming in, your alternate A teardrop, we have one advantage here. We're under Mode C, so we're all ADS-B.
Yeah.
And you can see traffic on whatever you've got, whether it's an iPad or whatever. A couple of times I've called in for a teardrop because we guys in the pattern get up there, they all landed. It was empty. I just called it, changed it, and it seems to be a lot easier.
The ADS-B thing, I got to tell you, I think a lot of general aviation went into that kicking and dragging. It was a big cost. At first, it was a big cost. I wouldn't fly without that now. And even in my Stearman, I have a Stratus, so I can download down to my laptop. So I flew the Stearman out to Galesburg, Illinois, and back. It was 11 stops and 22 hours of flying, and trucks were passing me on the freeway. But I had ADS-B the whole way because I had it downloaded from the Stratus. I don't fly airplanes anymore without ADS-B so that I can see what's going on. It's a game changer for mid-air collision avoidance.
The cost me a quarter of the value of my airplane.
Yeah, I tell you, at least you're alive, aren't you?
I didn't realize what I wasn't seeing until I got it.
I know, it's scary to see. And, you know, Jake will tell you, guys back here that flew Alaska Airlines years and years ago when they implemented the TCAS system, we started looking at that going, holy crap, I never knew this many people were out here before. But we had, you know, a system that was even before ADS-B. We had the TCAS system. So.
Do you know if the military helicopters, do they turn their transponders off sometimes?
I talked to them about that, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's a money thing. The active duty guys all have ADS-B, and they squawk, but they can turn it off if they want. But most of the time, flying around, they'll have it on. The Washington National Guard helicopter guys, for a long time, because of budget constraints, didn't install it in the helicopters, and so they would fly around and you wouldn't pick them up on the ADS-B at all. However, just lately they have started installing it in their helicopters. But you'll still find helicopter here and a helicopter there from the Washington National Guard that doesn't have anything in it. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I'm also visual looking.
Yeah. Any other questions at all? Good. Oh, all right, here we go. See? Gotta go to the mic. Gotta go to the mic. We're trying to record it. That's why he's trying to put it on the mic.
In the beginning, you had a statistic about training.
Yes.
Accidents with a flight instructor in.
Yep.
Since the surge of the training over the last, 7 years or the big 5-year,
Really about 10 years.
Yeah. Well, the major increase that we've had, how is that related to incidents?
That statistic, the 62% of all midair collisions are dual flights. That's an average over 20 years. That's the beginning of that chart was 2000, and then the end was 2021, and that 62% was that whole 20-year period. So the only reason I present that is for the CFIs in the room. Just because you're a CFI doesn't mean that you're not going to have a collision. The one that really tears me up is the one that happened down here in Lakeland. There was a CFI and a student in a Cherokee 140 doing patterns at a non-towered airport. They did absolutely nothing wrong. The NTSB preliminary, they were flying the patterns, they were making the radio calls, they didn't do anything wrong. Float plane operation, a very famous float plane operation, for the purposes of not having to spend more money, didn't have a radio or an electrical system in their float planes, and chose to fly their approach to the lake a mile off the end of the non-towered airport, and they ended up having a head-on mid-air collision on base leg for a and that's, I keep saying non-controller, non-towered airport. 2017, does everybody realize that the FAA changed the name of these? They're not uncontrolled airports anymore. They're now non-towered airports. And it was explained to me that the main reason for changing the name was to get rid of the paradigm that there aren't any rules out here. So it's not uncontrolled, it's a non-towered airport. So.
One other question on helicopters. Say they're on the last 800 feet, north 800 feet, you're landing on 3-4. Can you land 3,000 feet, small airplane? Figuring out if they're going to take off or whatever before you get there.
I got into this up at Skagit. This was a big deal when I did a presentation up at Skagit. And I yelled uncle, and I went back to the FAA, and I started talking to the FSDO, the Seattle FSDO, talked to Schaefer and a couple other guys here. There is no FAR or rule that says that you can only have one airplane on a runway at a time.
Makes sense. The band's got to take off.
There's absolutely no rule. And to find a rule for one airplane on the runway at a time, you have to go to the pilot controller glossary for towered airports. They have separation requirements. They can still have two airplanes on the runway at the same time. After one lands, they can taxi another airplane out behind it. So they have, it's not thou shalt not have two airplanes on the runway at the time. It's just a condition for when they can do that. But at a non-towered airport, there's no rule that says you can't have two people on the runway at the same time. It's kind of scary when you think about it, but it's not there. And they had a huge discussion about that up at Skagit because people doing straight-in approaches. They're almost comatose with upset up there at Skagit right now after 96.6 Charlie got published and said thou shalt not do straight-in approaches, because they had a core group of people up there that didn't want to fly the traffic pattern. They were going to fly straight-in approaches, didn't matter what I said. And now they're drinking a lot of beer, I guess. I don't know. Go ahead.
This isn't a question, just a comment.
Yeah.
It's my perception, maybe I'm wrong, that a lot of people are relying on technology to clear now. And I'm the guy who comes into Auburn, I call my position, I'm on the wrong frequency. I forgot to turn on my ADSB because I forgot my nav lights. And so I'm the guy. It's still C and void.
It's still C and void.
Okay.
That is paragraph B, 91-113B, C and void.
So you're the guy.
Listen, you know, I tell, like when I went down to Fun Field and I talked to a group of students down there, and I said, yeah, I've been doing this for 50 years, but that shouldn't be a big deal to you because it just means I made all the same mistakes that you're going to make. I just got through it all.
You just can't remember.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Jake knows we all made mistakes. So, all right. Any other questions for the microphone? You guys good? All right. Comments? Was this a useful presentation? Because I got to change it, you know. Okay. Well, good. Yeah, because I actually, when I was getting this thing all ready, Chris Slater, the fast team guy for the Seattle FISDO, called me up and goes, hey, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you mind giving that presentation online? I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Who's my audience? Well, about 300 FISDO inspectors. Shit.
Good.
So
Good.
I actually got through that with them on this thing, and I only had one guy that disagreed with me, and it was on that upwind entry. And so I finally said, okay. You're the FAA guy. It doesn't matter to me. Send me a letter on your letterhead stating that you want it however you want it. You just send that my way, and I'll change my presentation. Well, it's been a year and 3 months, and I haven't heard a word. So, all right, guys. Well, guys and gals, thanks for having me out. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.